It was winter in Germany, 1945. The air was white and heavy with cold. The ground was frozen so hard that every bootstep made a sharp crack. Hundreds of American soldiers stood in the snow, lined up outside a prison camp called Stalag 9A. Their faces were pale and tired, their coats thin, their breath rising in small clouds. They were prisoners of war, men who had fought bravely, been captured, and now waited for the day they could go home. But that morning, something different was about to happen. A German officer walked slowly down the line. His coat was dark, his gloves black, his boots shining. He stopped in front of the soldiers and shouted in a hard voice, "All Jewish soldiers, step forward." For a moment, no one moved. The air seemed to stop moving too. Every man knew what that order meant. If you stepped forward, you might never come back. The officer waited, his hand resting on the gun at his side. Still, no one moved. Then one man did. He wasn't Jewish. He was the one in charge of the other soldiers, a tall, calm man from Tennessee. His name was Roddie Edmonds. He looked straight at the German officer, his eyes steady, his face calm, even though his heart must have been pounding. In a quiet, strong voice, he said, "We are all Jews here." The officer frowned. He didn't understand. "No," he said, "only the Jews. Tell them to step forward." Roddie didn't move. "We are all Jews here," he said again. His voice didn't shake. The officer's face turned red. He pulled out his pistol and aimed it at Roddie's head. The camp fell silent. No one breathed. A single snowflake drifted between them and landed on the black barrel of the gun. Roddie didn't blink. He just stood there. Behind him, hundreds of men stood too, waiting, watching, holding their breath. In that stillness, something stronger than fear filled the air. The German officer stared at Roddie for a long moment. Then slowly he lowered his gun. "Very well," he muttered. He turned and walked away. No one was taken. Not one man. The soldiers didn't cheer. They didn't move. They just stood there, knowing they had all been saved by the courage of one man who refused to give in to hate. When the officer was gone, some of the men looked at Roddie. He said nothing. He only told them to get back inside before they froze. And that was it. The snow kept falling. The cold kept biting. But everyone there knew they had seen something they would never forget. In that moment, Roddie Edmonds saved about 200 men, and then he never spoke of it again. He didn't tell his family. He didn't ask for a medal. He simply went home and lived his life quietly, as if nothing had happened. But how could someone so brave be forgotten? Who was this man? And why did no one know his name? To understand that moment of defiance, we have to return to the quiet heart of Tennessee, where it all began. Roddie Edmonds was born in 1919 in Knoxville, Tennessee. It was a small southern town, the kind of place where everybody knew each other's names and most doors stayed unlocked. His family wasn't rich. They lived a simple life built on work, faith, and decency. His father fixed things for neighbors, his mother cooked for church gatherings, and Sunday mornings were never missed. The Edmonds family didn't talk about doing good. They just did it. Roddie grew up quiet, observant, never one to draw attention. He wasn't the kind of person who bragged or made a scene. He listened more than he spoke. As a boy, he'd sit on the porch with his father after dinner, watching fireflies drift above the yard while church bells echoed in the distance. Those small, steady sounds, the ring of a hammer, the creak of wood, the calm rhythm of life, shaped him more than he ever realized. When he was old enough, Roddie worked small jobs around town. He learned to respect hard work and fairness. He believed in rules, in kindness, and in keeping your word. His friends described him as the kind of guy who just did the right thing, even when no one was looking. That was who he was. By 1941, the world outside Knoxville had started to change. Europe was burning, and everyone knew America might be pulled into it sooner or later. When the call for enlistment came, Roddie didn't hesitate. Not because he wanted adventure or glory, he just felt it was his duty. He signed up for the U.S. Army that March. He was 21 years old. Training wasn't easy. Long days, cold mornings, endless drills. But Roddie didn't complain. He wasn't the loudest or fastest, but people noticed him because he was calm and steady. When others panicked, he didn't. When tempers flared, he cooled them down. By the time he became a sergeant, he had already earned something harder to get than stripes: respect. The men under him trusted him completely. During his service, Roddie wrote letters home to his parents and to his sweetheart. They weren't grand or dramatic. He'd write about missing Tennessee sunsets, about the food, about his buddies in the unit. There was one letter where he said, "I'm doing fine. The boys are good men. We take care of each other." That was his way: short words, big meaning. His unit, the 106th Infantry Division, was new and young. Many of the soldiers had never been in combat before. They shipped out late in 1944, bound for Europe. For most of them, it was the first time leaving American soil. Roddie tried to keep spirits up, cracking small jokes, checking on everyone. He had a fatherly air, though he was barely in his mid-20s. When they landed in Belgium, the mood changed. The war felt real. The air was colder, the nights darker. The soldiers heard artillery in the distance and saw wrecked villages along the roads. Still, they believed the fighting might be ending soon. The Germans were supposed to be on the run. It almost seemed over. But it wasn't. The calm before the storm never lasts long. In December 1944, the Germans launched one of their biggest surprise attacks, what history would call the Battle of the Bulge. Snow fell heavy that month. It was the coldest winter Europe had seen in years. The ground froze solid, and everything, every road, every hill, every field, turned into a battlefield. Roddie and his men found themselves surrounded, cut off from supplies, facing tanks and artillery they couldn't match. Many of them were captured. For the first time, Roddie was no longer the one giving orders. He was just another prisoner marching through the snow. But the men still looked to him. Even in chains, they followed his lead. He stayed calm. He made them believe they could make it through whatever came next. At that time, no one could have guessed what kind of test he would soon face, or how one decision in that frozen place would define him forever. But one day, everything changed. The quiet soldier from Tennessee was about to face the world's darkest test. The winter of 1944 came down like a hammer. The Battle of the Bulge had started, and chaos swallowed the snow-covered forests of Belgium. Roddie Edmonds and the men of the 106th Infantry Division were new to the front, barely settled when the German army struck. It was meant to be a quiet sector. That's what they'd been told. But before they knew it, shells were falling, trees were exploding, and the lines of defense were breaking apart faster than anyone could understand. Orders came late, messages got lost, and men were running blind in the cold. Roddie tried to keep his soldiers together, shouting through wind and snow, his voice rough and steady. But the enemy was everywhere. Tanks closing in, machine guns cutting through the white silence. They had no choice. Surrounded, outnumbered, and freezing, they were captured. The march began the next morning. Hundreds of American prisoners pushed along icy roads, boots slipping, stomachs empty. Some carried friends who couldn't walk anymore. The guards shouted in German, their rifles slung across their shoulders. The snow was up to their knees. Every breath hurt. They walked for days like that, hungry, cold, afraid, not knowing where they were going. Some men fell behind and didn't get up again. Roddie stayed in the middle of the group, helping where he could. He told the men to stay together, to keep moving, to not let go of hope. His calm was like a rope they could hold on to. After days on the road, they reached Stalag 9A, a German prisoner camp near Ziegenhain. The camp was surrounded by tall fences and towers where guards watched with rifles. The smell hit first: damp wood, sweat, and sickness. Inside, the men were given thin soup, a scrap of bread, and straw bunks stacked in rows. There were lice, rats, and the constant sound of boots on frozen ground. Each day was about surviving, finding warmth, sharing food, keeping each other alive. Roddie was the highest-ranking non-commissioned officer among the Americans there, which meant the men looked to him for everything, even inside enemy walls. He set rules. Stay together, share rations, respect each other, and never forget who you are. He kept count of his men. He checked on the sick. He prayed with the ones who were losing hope. It wasn't about control. It was about dignity, holding on to a small piece of what made them human. Weeks passed. Then one morning, the German officers called Roddie to the command post. Their tone was different. They told him that all Jewish soldiers in the camp must be identified and separated from the rest. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Roddie knew exactly what that meant. The Jewish soldiers wouldn't be treated like the others. They'd be sent away, and no one would see them again. He also knew the risk of saying no. Disobedience could get him shot on the spot. He returned to the barracks in silence. The men looked at him, waiting for orders. The Jewish soldiers, some openly known, others not, tried to hide their fear. Roddie didn't shout or panic. He simply said, "No one steps forward." The men stared at him, unsure if they'd heard right. "No one," he repeated. "We're all soldiers. That's all they need to know." His words were quiet but firm. The next morning, the Germans came to collect the Jewish POWs. The commandant and his armed guards stood outside the barracks. The air was sharp and cold, the sky gray. They shouted for the Jews to step forward. Inside, hundreds of American soldiers looked at each other, and then they all walked out together. Every single one. The German officer froze, confused. That's when Roddie stepped to the front and said the words that would echo through history. "We are all Jews here." No one knew what would happen next. A gun was drawn. Men held their breath. The line between life and death was as thin as the frost on their faces. But in that single instant, Roddie had made his choice: defiance over obedience, courage over survival. And then it was over. After the war ended, the world moved on quickly. The names of generals filled the newspapers. Medals were handed out. Cities were rebuilt. But the story of a quiet sergeant from Tennessee never made it past the barracks walls. The men who had seen it kept their memories close. Roddie came home, unpacked his uniform, and went back to normal life. He didn't talk about what happened in that camp. He got married, worked regular jobs, raised a family, and went to church on Sundays. To most people, he was just another veteran trying to live in peace. No reporters came. No history books told his story. The world forgot what he had done, or maybe it never knew. Roddie never chased attention. He didn't think of himself as a hero. Maybe that's why he never said a word about it, even to his own son. If stories like this matter to you, make sure you subscribe before this one is forgotten again. For decades, nobody spoke of it, until someone opened an old box. It was years after the war when Roddie Edmonds passed away, long before anyone knew what he had done. Life went on quietly the way he liked it. His son, Chris, grew up respecting his father's calm strength but never really knowing what those years in Europe had held. He only knew his dad had been a soldier, one of many who'd done their duty and come home. To Chris, his father was just dad. A steady man, a churchgoer, someone who fixed things with his hands and believed in doing right without talking about it. Decades later, after Roddie was gone, Chris found himself sorting through old family boxes. He was looking for something simple, photos, maybe a few letters, but instead, he found history waiting in silence. Inside an old trunk were small, worn items: a rusted dog tag, faded photographs, and a weathered brown notebook. The pages were filled with his father's handwriting. Dates, names, and tiny notes written in pencil. At first glance, it looked like a simple soldier's log. But as Chris turned the pages, he noticed something different. In the list of names, some had a small mark next to them, a symbol maybe, or just a tiny cross. It didn't make sense right away. Curious, he started reading deeper. Some entries were plain: cold again today. Lost another man. Others were haunting. Stalag 9A. Command gave order. Refused. Refused what? The word sat heavy on the page. Chris didn't understand yet, but he felt something stir inside him. A question that wouldn't go away. Not long after, Chris attended a reunion of World War II veterans. He went hoping to meet men who might have served with his father. In the crowd, he found a few who remembered the name Edmonds. One of them, an older man with kind eyes, shook his head in disbelief. "Your dad," he said quietly, "saved our lives." Chris blinked, unsure if he heard right. "What do you mean?" he asked. The man nodded slowly. "Stalag 9A, he said. "We were prisoners. The Germans wanted the Jews to step forward. Your father stood in front of all of us and said, 'We're all Jews here.' He saved about 200 men that day." The room seemed to fall away. Chris felt like time had stopped. All those years, and his father had never said a word. He went home with tears in his eyes and 1,000 questions in his heart. He couldn't let it rest there. He needed to know the truth, not just for himself, but for history. He started making calls, digging through archives, and contacting historians. He searched old military records, survivor testimonies, and POW registries. Each time he found a small clue, it led to another. He read letters written by soldiers who'd been in that same camp. Some mentioned a sergeant from Tennessee. Some wrote about how that sergeant had stared down a Nazi officer's gun and refused to give up his men. The more Chris read, the clearer it became. This wasn't a rumor. It was real. He pieced together the timeline, the Battle of the Bulge, the capture, the camp, the order, the defiance. Each fragment of history lined up perfectly. And every testimony said the same thing. Without Roddie Edmonds, many would not have survived. One soldier's letter said it best. "He stood there for us, calm as ever. We thought he was done for, but he didn't flinch. I'll never forget that." Another wrote simply, "He saved my life. I wish I'd told him thank you." By the time Chris finished his search, the weight of it all hit him. The man he'd known as a quiet, ordinary father had been something else entirely. A man who had risked his life for others without ever seeking recognition. Chris sat with that truth for a long time. It wasn't pride he felt most. It was awe. Awe that courage could be so silent, that decency could be so complete it never needed to be spoken. He closed the notebook and whispered, "You never told us, Dad." But deep down he understood why. Some acts of courage aren't meant for medals. They're meant to live quietly, waiting for the right moment to be found. Before I show you what happened next, how the world finally learned the truth about this forgotten hero, tell me in the comments. If your father had done something this brave, would you have been able to stay silent too? The truth was finally coming out, and the world was about to remember. In 2015, 70 years after that freezing morning in Germany, the world finally spoke Roddie Edmonds' name out loud. It began in Jerusalem, at Yad Vashem, Israel's official memorial to the victims and heroes of the Holocaust. Chris Edmonds stood before a quiet audience, holding a framed photograph of his father in uniform. The room was still, the air thick with memory. On that day, Roddie Edmonds was officially recognized as righteous among the nations, one of only a few Americans ever to receive the honor. The title is reserved for those who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. People who acted with no reward, no promise, only conscience. When the announcement was made, a few of the men who had survived Stalag 9A were there. They were old now, their hair silver, their hands unsteady, but their voices carried the same weight they had held in youth. One man, tears streaming down his face, said, "Your father stood between us and death. Without him, none of us would be here." Another added softly, "He didn't just save lives, he saved our faith in humanity." Chris listened, unable to speak. For the first time, he was hearing his father's story not from dusty records or typed reports, but from the living men whose lives had been spared. Their words filled the room, heavy and sacred. In their voices, Roddie's courage lived again. When it came time to lay flowers in his father's honor, Chris placed them gently, whispering a thank you that had waited decades to be said. Around him were faces of people he'd never met, yet somehow knew, the children and grandchildren of the men his father had saved. They had grown up because of a choice made in silence on a bitter winter morning. And now, generations later, they stood together as proof of what one man's decency could do. The recognition did not stop there. Back home in the United States, news spread quickly. Articles appeared in Time, The Washington Post, and countless local papers. Reporters told the story of a man who had stared down a Nazi pistol and said 5 simple words that defied hate. Schools began teaching his story. Churches shared it in sermons. Veterans groups read it aloud during ceremonies. For a moment, America paused to remember a hero who never asked to be one. Soon after, the U.S. Congress began working to honor him officially. Lawmakers introduced a bill to award Roddie Edmonds the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the nation's highest civilian honors. On the floor of the House, one congressman said, "Master Sergeant Edmonds reminds us that moral courage is often greater than military strength." Even decades after his death, his act was changing lives, inspiring others to speak out against injustice wherever they found it. As Chris traveled to share his father's story, he noticed something powerful. It didn't matter who listened, young or old, soldier or student. Everyone leaned in when they heard that moment. "We are all Jews here." Those 5 words crossed faith, race, and nationality. They were bigger than the war. They were about what it means to be human. Classrooms began telling the story not just as a lesson in history, but as a lesson in character. Museums added his name to exhibits on moral courage. In Tennessee, a plaque was placed in his memory. And at Yad Vashem, his name was carved in stone among those who stood for what was right when the world seemed lost. Chris once said in an interview, "My father's story isn't about war. It's about peace. It's about the moment when a man decided that every life was worth his own." That line became the heart of every article, every tribute, every retelling. Because that's what people felt when they heard it, peace. Not pride, not nationalism, just a quiet belief that decency still matters. 70 years is a long time to wait for recognition, but maybe it came exactly when the world needed it most. In a time when division and anger often feel louder than kindness, Roddie Edmonds' story reminded people what true bravery looks like. Not loud, not violent, but steady, human, and deeply good. If the story touched you, share it so it's never forgotten again. Let people know that one man's courage can still speak louder than hate. But even now, his story means more than any medal because it speaks to something deeper. Courage isn't always loud. It doesn't always wear medals or march in parades. Sometimes it stands quietly in the cold, hands shaking, heart pounding, but refusing to back down. That's what Roddie Edmonds taught us. His strength didn't come from power or rank. It came from conviction, from an unshakable belief that right and wrong don't bend, even under a gun. In that frozen camp, surrounded by fear, he made a choice most people only hope they'd have the courage to make, to stand for others when it mattered most. His words still echo across time. "We are all Jews here." They weren't just words of defiance. They were words of unity. In that moment, he wasn't talking about religion or nationality. He was reminding the world of something deeper, that every person, no matter where they come from, deserves to live with dignity. And if we lose sight of that, we lose a piece of our own humanity. Today, those 5 words mean even more. "We are all Jews here" can be heard as "we are all human here." In a time when division and anger often fill the space between us, Roddie's stand reminds us that moral courage doesn't belong to the past. It belongs to everyone who chooses decency over fear, compassion over hate. Courage can look like speaking up when it's easier to stay silent, defending someone who's been singled out, or simply refusing to let cruelty pass unchecked. It's not about heroism. It's about humanity. Roddie Edmonds didn't act to make history. He acted because it was right. That's what makes his story timeless. His kind of courage doesn't fade. It waits quietly in each of us, waiting for the moment we need it. His legacy isn't just about the 200 men he saved. It's about the millions who can still learn from his example. When we remember him, we don't just honor the past. We protect the future. Every time his story is told, every time someone hears those words and feels a spark of conscience, that same quiet bravery lives again. History reminds us that evil survives on silence, and goodness survives on memory. So before you go, take a second to do something small that matters. Like this video so the story reaches more people, leave a comment with what "we are all human here" means to you, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story of real American courage. And if this moment moved you, if you believe these stories should never fade, subscribe and stand with us in keeping them alive. In a frozen camp, One American's quiet stand reminded the world that decency still breathes, even in the coldest of places.